to come back for a moment to this our initial topic about the preparedness to defend Taiwan. My earlier guest, Rick Fisher, he actually came up with a brilliant idea. He suggested here on the show. He said instead of spending billions of dollars on those big ticket items, maybe the government should buy like a few million rifles and store them in police precincts. And then every Taiwanese man would go over the weekend, pick up the gun, go on a shooting range, leave it back in a precinct, and then do this over months and years. And he said then the cost of attacking Taiwan would be immensely, like, unbelievably high for the PLA. If we had, let's say, few million Taiwanese men who all would be, well versed in shooting. What do you guys think about that? Because I would really like to continue this topic a little bit. So what do you think? I think it's a brilliant idea. It would be much cheaper and much more efficient.
I think it's an incomplete idea. It's not a bad idea. I've written something sort of kind of related to that, suggesting that we all need to be much more prepared. I've also written that we need more women involved as well, and a lot more civic involvement. Having a lot more individual rifles would be excellent. The thing is, though, is that those big ticket weapons, particularly things like missiles and so on and so forth, the whole point of those is to make sure that the Chinese troops don't land on Taiwan in the first place. So I don't think it's an either or choice. I think we need to make sure that missiles sink ships. They shoot down helicopters. They make sure that the troops don't arrive in the first place. So we definitely need those. And then there's the case for things like, a more of the big ticket Navy and Air Force items that a lot in the U.S. argue is, it doesn't work with a porcupine strategy of, making Taiwan hard to impregnable. But the thing is that quite possibly the biggest risk is not so much a land invasion of Taiwan, but a blockade, in that it's a far cheaper for China to just simply use their massive navy, which right now, in terms of the number of boats, not actual tonnage, but is the largest in the world, and resupply of Taiwan in case of a blockade is extremely difficult, partly because of the distances involved, but also because Taiwan, depending on the type of fuel, natural gas or coal, which is primarily how Taiwan powers itself, those two, the reserves are 10 days, 2 weeks. I think it's 10 days for natural gas. I think it's longer for coal, but, in both cases, it's, the amount of time that Taiwan can hold out is limited. Now, food, Taiwan can last for months and months and months. But power is something that would go out after, maybe a month. For the most part, Taiwan would be without power. They're coming up with backup plans for the internet via satellite because the cables will obviously be cut. So really, the rifles would be great if the Chinese can get here, reach land. But again, your average citizen with a rifle still is no replacement for a well-trained soldier. So my preference would be, I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but I think it's an extreme backup plan. Because ideally we would have more and better trained reservists. We would have more and better trained civilians who know how to use those rifles. But also that we concentrate on things like power reserves and internet backup plans. And, the government is working on these things. I just think too slowly. But we want to make sure that they can't blockade us, or if they do, there's plenty of time to resupply us. And I think that's our first priority, and to be able to blow everything up, in the Taiwan Strait before it even gets here, before we start, but then, and then train people and make sure that people here know how to use those rifles and how to organize and how to fight back, in ways that would actually be effective. Just giving a person a gun by itself, who isn't trained, is basically cannon fodder. So ideally, there would be more widespread training. So I'm glad to see that they've extended um, conscription from 4 months back to 1 year starting next year. That's a good first step forward. They're extending reservist training. There are these private training which are great for backup for things like first aid, and evacuating civilians is really what they're learning how to do. Um, so all these things are good first steps, but I do think they need to be taking more steps on all fronts.
Very well said, Donovan. One thing I would add is that I think that sometimes there tends to be a little bit, especially with the recent tension, cross-strait tension, perhaps a bit of an over-militarization of this situation. It's not saying we shouldn't be prepared, but China's last resort is attacking Taiwan, or even trying to coerce Taiwan with a blockade into surrender. It's really a last resort. I wrote a piece for the Jamestown Foundation recently on how Xi Jinping thinks about Taiwan. And you can go through his speeches and look at all the information that's out there. A lot of it is in the public domain. They're still trying to work with politicians in Taiwan whom they think would be amenable to some kind of a settlement. So I think we often forget about that, and there's an election coming up. And what might China try to do? Will they? Can they still interfere in this? I mean, we hear a lot of course, we know that China engages in a lot of disinformation campaigns. Are those going to be influential at all? Or Taiwanese too well versed in what China does to be influenced before they go to cast their vote? And then, if the DPP loses power, how might China try to engage with somebody from either of the major opposition parties? And what kind of pressure might they put on non-DPP politicians once in power? Because my view is that perhaps in a first term that China would take it slowly, hope that person could be reelected, and then the second term, try to push forward with reunification. And I think that's often just overlooked by people who are focused on what arms Taiwan needs to defend itself, and they're not looking at what the Chinese leadership is saying, and the fact that they have put Wang Huning in charge of that, who's the number four in the Chinese system, who's in charge of Taiwan in his role. Which is not to say there isn't a military risk. There is, but Taiwanese, if you look at what Taiwanese media, what a lot of the pro-DPP media says, they are worried. They seem to be quite concerned about, opposition politicians who might, I'm not naming anyone specifically, but if somebody from a nominally pro-China party had the presidency at this time of higher cross-strait tension, what might that mean for Taiwan and for its political status in the future? I think we need to be looking at China putting pressure on somebody later on down the line to agree to reunification, and what might that president be willing to do to use the law of the ROC Constitution to implement martial law? It's happened before. Or would it be impossible because people simply wouldn't go along? I just think we need to be exploring all the different possibilities, not just the D-Day type scenario. I think it's highly unlikely.
By the way, the explosions that you just heard in the background here, if you heard them, if the microphone picked it up, those were fireworks. We're not being invaded.
I didn't hear them, but
No,
I
I
just
didn't.
know that it's often forgotten. The KMT party state, not by Donovan, of course, but implemented martial law for 40 years in Taiwan. That's still in the constitution. The president can declare it with the legislative yuan, the Taiwan's parliament, may or may not consent to that. But that's just something people say. They tell me, "Oh, that's impossible. It'll never happen." I said, "Well, the cost of doing that for someone who is very pro-China, who gets the presidency of Taiwan, is a lot lower than saying we're going to fight a war with China." So I think we just need to be cognizant that China really very much prefers to avoid a shooting war because of the costs that would be involved, even if China could perhaps win. It's unclear if they could, but in terms of economic costs, in terms of human costs, in terms of their reputation, probably the least important to them. But the Communist Party's political mandate in the PRC would be, I think they could still hang on to power, but it would be damaged by a loss in Taiwan. So these are things I think that are often overlooked as people outside of Taiwan, speculate on when the invasion's coming. That China has a lot of other options. I'd be interested to know from Donovan, what first of all, does he foresee, a non-DPP candidate winning in 2024? What's the likelihood of that, and if so, what might that mean for the cross-strait relationship? As you are um, the authority, one of the authorities in Taiwan, on the domestic political situation. Ho Yoi has not been performing so well, but these are early days.
There is, I think, there's I think an assumption right now that with a three-way race with an opposition split, that Taichung of the DPP has an easy path to the presidency. I think that's a mistaken assumption, because of what Taiwanese call the dump save effect, which is strategic voting. So if the opposition, the two opposition candidates, Ko-Wenza of the relatively new Taiwan People's Party and Ho Yoi of the Kuomintang, if one of the two candidates starts to really sink in the polls, there's a large percentage of the population that just doesn't like the DPP, and for various reasons, and not always with anything to do with China. I mean, there's other reasons, historical, ethnic, and so on and so forth. And the DPP recently has had a lot of problems. I just wrote a column on the DPP. There's kind of a rot in the culture of the party right now. And I'm pan green, so it was a painful column to write, but it's the truth. I mean, the party's kind of rotten right now. They've had a lot of corruption issues, Me Too problems. And so, the party's not looking great, to be honest with you. So if one of the two opposition candidates, either Ko-Wenza or Ho Yoi, if one of them starts to really pull ahead of the other one, voters may dump the one that's failing in the polls to save the one who is rising in the polls. And if the DPP can't really deal with the rot in its own culture and present a strong case, there is a possibility that voters will unite around an opposition candidate and could propel them over the finish line. As things stand right now, it does look like the DPP will keep power, but I can foresee a fair number of scenarios where that's not the case. So, I think the DPP really needs to tackle problems in their own culture. Ho Yoi of the KMT, the Kuomintang, is so far really faltering out of the gate. Ko-Wenza of the new Taiwan People's Party has been doing a pretty good job of getting himself a lot of attention and positioning himself pretty much right smack dab in the center of public opinion. And Taichung of the DPP is forced into a defensive crouch, partly because of rot going on within the party, but also having to defend 8 years of the Tsai administration, whose foreign policy and policies toward China have been extremely popular, but domestic policies, not so much. So he's in a kind of a defensive crouch. So, I can foresee a lot of different scenarios going forward to next January's election.
I think that's a great point about the DPP because it's ironic. They used to be the opposition, but now they're the incumbent, and they're encountering a lot of the same institutional issues that the KMT has in the past. That was one of the reasons why voters kicked the KMT out of power. I think that it's not exceptional. It's not specific so much to a problem, fundamental problem with the DPP as a political party. It's just that when you become the incumbent, when you become the establishment, there are certain vulnerabilities that may open up as you, especially if you keep power for a long time and there's a weak opposition, as there has been for the past 8 years. So interesting, Donovan calls it institutional rot. I would say that those domestic issues are often not what capture headlines outside of Taiwan, but certainly, the DPP's pandemic policy was popular initially, but when your policy is based on not having any of this virus in the country and not having any deaths, and then you have 20,000 deaths, I mean, you can't say you did a great job because who celebrates 20,000 deaths, right? Or however much it was. So I don't think that's really something they can run on anymore.
I would like
As
to
for
add
the,
something,
mm,
Matthew, because you mentioned here, some time ago, this scenario when, let's say, the Kuomintang wins, and then, as Donovan said, maybe somebody tries to approach China and sell out the island. I mean, we had a similar situation during Ma Ying-jeou, as just Donovan described 10 minutes ago. And the people opposed, they took to the streets and they made it impossible. So I think
mm,
even if this happens, okay, maybe they could come up with another smarter scenario, but I think the people might prevent this from happening as they did before.
well, I agree with you. They certainly would oppose it vociferously. My point was that it really depends, and I don't know, I can't say I could at this point judge how either Ho or Ke would deal with such an issue. They don't ostensibly look like the type of people who would necessarily sell out Taiwan. I'm thinking more of a generic pro-China personality in power, but just I think we need to be aware that certainly there are very much anti-democratic elements in the power structure in Taiwan, in the business community, in some of the in some of the opposition. That it's been, they made themselves very clear. And if China was putting pressure on Taiwan, if it was either fight or the alternative, I do think there would be those who would look to use the law. China subdued Hong Kong through lawfare. Now, Taiwan has a standing military that's capable, has the US as an ally, it has geography on its side compared to Hong Kong. But I just think that if you look at some of the opposition politicians, she's not running this year, but if you look at Hong Shou-ju, who has been in China and celebrated Xinjiang, the situation in Xinjiang, said it's going well. I think Guo Taiming, Terry Gou said that. What did he say about weapons? This was in 2019, but he said that if Taiwan had were to build up its weapons stockpile, that might attract the wrong kind of attention from China, and it would be better to not build up all those weapons, then you wouldn't be attacked. That was the rough translation, but you certainly see these are prominent personalities, right? Taiwan's richest individual, one of the richest. Sorry, may not be the
He
richest.
was the richest at
He
one
was
point. Yeah.
right now. He's not number one. I'm just saying that and the former president of Taiwan was recently in China and came back, and one of the first things he told reporters was it's a choice between war or peace. I just think that you have some people, they're not now uh, so powerful in the political system, but they were in the past, and I'm not sure how to measure what kind of support there is for their ideas, but we just need to be cognizant of that and not assume that there couldn't be some kind of a political situation that China would try to exploit. I do agree, however, though, that Taiwan's people wouldn't go along with any of that. It would be more. It come down to more. Would the government be willing to impose martial law and crack down, and would the security forces go along with it? That's the question, not whether people would oppose it. people would oppose it. So that's what I'm saying is, it really depends on who becomes president and what their perception of risk with China is, and how they, are they committed to Taiwan's democracy? Are they committed to representative democracy in Taiwan, protecting Taiwan's sovereignty? I hope that does come up as we get closer to the election, because that's really a key issue if China starts to put pressure on Taiwan. I think with Lai Ching-te, there's no question. With the opposition politicians, we don't know that much about them.
Donovan, and then maybe we could slowly wrap it up because I think it's maybe both of you, Donovan, and then maybe Matthew. What would you say to all this, Donovan?
Well, on Terry Gou, who, by the way, for audience members who aren't aware of who he is, he was the founder of Foxconn. Hanhai locally is the name that they use, but overseas known as Foxconn. And he was the richest person in Taiwan. And he may still yet run for president. And he does have a support base. I don't think he could win, but he has had some interesting ideas, as Matt pointed out. I can clarify the remarks that he made, is that he specifically opposed buying American arms. Not so much and then he talked about how Taiwan needs to develop its own weaponry using high tech, which of course is a bit self-serving, considering it's he founded an electronics an electronics company, which, by the way, Taiwan's military won't purchase anything from, because he has such extensive because the company has such extensive business and personal ties in China that the Taiwanese military will not source anything from that company. And then he said, which got a lot of amusement, is that he said that he would create 80,000 robots to defend Taiwan, and that was his plan for defending Taiwan against China. Anyway, that's just on Terry Gou. I don't know what else you want me to comment on, but I just thought that was kind of a funny anecdote. 80,000 robots, that's the defense plan.
I think that Terry Gou is just his interests in China are such that it would be hard for him to be elected, but he can, he had that heart-to-heart chat with Ko Wen-je and Jinmen. Mm-hmm. Great photograph. If the audience hasn't seen that, you can go look for it on Google. It's fantastic. But my point was just that if you look at the Want group, I think, is he Tsai Ing-mung? Is he now Taiwan's richest man? He's openly pro-China.
I don't think it's either one right now, but they're both in the top.
Let's just say 10. Top five. The former president of Taiwan visiting China, the former KMT chairman and presidential candidate Hong Shou-ju is a regular in China. She's gone further than Ma Ying-jeou, certainly, in praising the CCP in one country, two systems. I will say that Ma has been much more in Republic of China orthodoxy territory, right, Donovan? But his viewpoints are I'd say, probably not so in line with the mainstream electorate in Taiwan. But I think that we just really need to be looking at the opposition carefully and scrutinizing how they would, and that's separate from, could they win over domestic issues? It's quite possible people in Taiwan may just want to give someone else a chance at the presidency but if this really becomes an ultimate referendum on cross-strait relations, which it has in the past, this election, but it really, some of that does, I think, depend on China. I would think that if China really stays low key and doesn't threaten Taiwan extensively in the coming months, and we certainly can't count on that, they may do so deliberately to try to, help the non-DPP. And I would say that maybe the KMT is their traditional preference, but if Ko Wen-je looks like a winner, he has a history of going to Shanghai and being able to, at least at the local level, engage with China. He says certain things they certainly don't like. He's very outspoken, but compared to the DPP, he's a fresh face. He has engaged with them before. I don't think at the beginning they would count him out the way they would the DPP. And one more thing I would say about the DPP is that While their cross-strait policy may be broadly popular, I think they need to think about what their policy would be for the following 4 years if China continues to refuse to talk to them. Is there any way to try to at least rhetorically, gain the upper hand and appear to be really interested in engagement with China? But China's the one who's holding that up, because if you look at the propaganda messaging coming out of the different channels in China, it's changed from wartime footing or threatening Taiwan militarily much more to the DPP is responsible. They're solely responsible for preventing normal cross-strait exchanges. They're hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. They're a small group of secessionist forces and the Taiwanese people are not interested in what the DPP has to offer if they just could be put out, if they can be defeated in the election, if reasonable politicians can come to power, then everything can be fine. And I think that's quite an interesting change in strategy from the more militaristic posturing of recent years. So the DPP, I think, has not been very effective in combating that propaganda narrative. They seem to have their hands full with other issues right now. But that's something to think about later on down the line. If they do win re-election, are they going to just proceed with the same formula of the past few years, especially if China has some different ideas or ways of trying to put pressure on Taiwan? I think
Donovan, your last word.
Actually, Taichung, the DPP candidate, has explicitly said he's just going to carry forward Tsai's policies when it comes to dealing with China and overseas relations. So I don't think there's no sign of any original thinking there. But the thing is that the bottom line that the DPP holds, which is popular, the problem is that the Chinese Communist Party has made it absolutely clear you have to accept the one China principle embodied in the 1992 consensus. Otherwise, they won't talk, period. And the thing is the one China principle basically says Taiwan is a part of China, which means that you're basically right out of the gate saying, we don't exist really. You're just giving up your sovereignty rhetorically. And that's unacceptable to the DPP and to the Taiwanese public. As Matt noted, the Ko Wen-je is interesting. He refuses to accept the 1992 consensus or the one China principle. But he does seem a little bit more flexible rhetorically. So China, I think Matt's right. China might possibly be willing to talk to him. But to Matt's point, I don't. The DPP explicitly, Lai Ching-te has explicitly said, I'm going to keep going the way Tsai Ing-wen has, and that has been popular domestically. So that makes sense. So yeah, and then with the KMT, the thing is, the KMT is not in the overseas press. It's kind of painted one way or the other. The reality is the KMT is a complicated party. Matt referred to Hong Xiu-zhu. There's others, Zhang Yazhong, who basically want to begin negotiations on being annexed by China soon. Then there are those like Ma Ying-jeou, which I think Matt put it well, ROC orthodoxy. He was setting the stage for an eventual unification with China. I think his timeline would have been more like 15, 20 years. Ko Wen-je has flat out said it's not going to happen anytime soon because Taiwan society, culture, and love of democracy just simply wouldn't permit it. Taiwanese people wouldn't accept it, and the DPP is against it flat out, permanently, forever. So those are kind of the political nuances.
Good. Okay. I would like to thank both of you very much for your time. It was really fantastic.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Donovan.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Thank you so much.